At the mouth of the Nile, where the river meets the sea, there is a place that does not appear on any ancient map that has survived, and yet it was one of the busiest ports in the ancient Mediterranean world for more than 1,000 years. It sat on a low island of sediment at the edge of the Egyptian delta, surrounded by lagoon water on 3 sides and open to the sea on the 4th. Ships came to it from Greece and from Phoenicia and from the trading ports of the eastern Mediterranean, carrying the goods that moved across the ancient world: wine and olive oil from the Aegean, timber from the forests of Lebanon, grain moving in the other direction from the vast agricultural wealth of Egypt toward the cities that depended on it. The city collected taxes on everything that passed through its harbor. It housed the officials who administered the collection of those taxes. It held temples to the gods whose blessing was required before a ship could continue into Egypt, and to the gods whose protection was needed at sea. And it held a population of merchants and priests and administrators and craftspeople and sailors who made of this low island at the edge of a river delta one of the most consequential places in the ancient Mediterranean trading world. Its Egyptian name was Thonis. Its Greek name was Heracleion, after the hero Heracles, whom the Greeks identified with the Egyptian god who was worshipped in the city's most important temple. Both names appear in ancient texts, in inscriptions, and in the accounts of ancient writers, and for a long time scholars debated whether the two names referred to one city or two. The answer, established beyond doubt by the archaeological work of the past 2 decades, is that they referred to one, a single city at the entrance to Egypt that was known by different names to the different peoples who passed through it, and that served as the point of contact between Egypt and the Mediterranean world for most of the first millennium before the Common Era. The ancient writers who mentioned Heracleion were not describing a city they had visited personally. They were recording a name, a location, a function, in the way that ancient geographers recorded the significant places of the known world without always having first-hand knowledge of them. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus mentioned it. The geographer Strabo located it. The myth that connected Heracles and Helen of Troy to this place, which gave the Greek name its significance, appears in several ancient sources. But the city itself, the physical reality behind the name, had been gone for centuries by the time most of these accounts were written, and the precise location of the place that the ancient writers were describing was unknown to the modern world until the divers found it on the floor of the Bay of Abu Qir at the beginning of the 21st century. And then it was gone. Sometime in the centuries following the year 800, the island on which the city stood began to fail. The sediment beneath it, saturated with water and compressed by the weight of centuries of construction above it, liquefied and shifted, and the city sank into the lagoon. Not all at once, and not in a single catastrophic event, but gradually, over a period that may have extended across generations, the buildings of Thonis-Heracleion tilted and fell and were covered by the water and the mud of the Egyptian coastal lagoon. By the time the medieval period arrived, there was nothing visible above the water's surface to indicate that anything had ever been there. The city had not been destroyed by conquest or by fire. It had been swallowed, whole and largely intact, by the sea. It stayed under the water for more than 1,200 years. The texts that mentioned it continued to be read by scholars who had no idea where the city had been located or whether any physical trace of it remained. And then, in the year 2000, a team of underwater archaeologists working in the Egyptian coastal lagoon known as the Bay of Abu Qir found, beneath 3 to 5 meters of water and a thick layer of sediment, the remains of a city. The statues were still standing, or lying where they had fallen. The temple foundations were intact. The anchors of ships that had moored in the harbor were still in the mud. The inscribed steels that had recorded the decrees of the pharaohs were still legible. The city that had sunk into the sea more than 1,000 years before was still there, waiting. The Egyptian delta is one of the most layered landscapes in the world, a place where the physical geography and the human history have been accumulating on top of each other for so long that the present surface is only the most recent layer of a deep stratigraphy that reaches back thousands of years. The Nile Delta is formed by the sediment that the river carries down from the interior of Africa and deposits at its mouth, building outward into the Mediterranean over millions of years to create the broad fan of fertile land that has been the agricultural heart of Egypt since the earliest periods of human settlement. The delta is not stable. It shifts constantly as the river changes course, as floods deposit new layers of sediment, and as the weight of those sediments compresses the material beneath them, causing the land to subside slowly into the sea. The coastline of ancient Egypt was different from the coastline of modern Egypt, and the coastline of medieval Egypt was different again, and the difference between these successive coastlines represents the accumulated effect of thousands of years of sedimentation, subsidence, and sea level change that has buried or drowned most of the physical evidence of ancient settlement in the delta region. Thonis-Heracleion was built on a particularly unstable part of this landscape, a low island of sand and sediment at the western edge of the delta, surrounded by the shallow lagoon water that lies between the coast and the open sea. The island was created by the same processes that created the rest of the delta, the deposition of sediment carried by one of the ancient branches of the Nile, and it was subject to the same processes of subsidence and erosion that have affected the entire delta region. The fact that it supported a major city for more than 1,000 years is a testament to the efforts of its inhabitants to maintain and reinforce the ground beneath them, and the fact that it eventually failed is a consequence of the fundamental instability of the landscape on which they had built. The lagoon in which Thonis-Heracleion stood, known today as the Bay of Abu Qir, is a shallow body of water on the Egyptian Mediterranean coast west of the Nile Delta. In the ancient period it was a more extensive body of water, and its margins were lined with settlements and sanctuaries that took advantage of the protected anchorage it offered and the access it provided to the Nile and through the Nile to the interior of Egypt. The remains of several of these settlements have been identified by underwater archaeologists working in the bay, and the distribution of these remains gives a sense of the density of human activity that once characterized this now largely empty coastal lagoon. The physical conditions that preserved Thonis-Heracleion through more than 12 centuries of submersion are the same conditions that make underwater archaeology in this region both possible and extraordinarily challenging. The sediment that covers the city, a mixture of fine sand and clay deposited by the currents of the lagoon over many centuries, is thick enough to have protected the buried remains from the mechanical erosion and chemical dissolution that would have destroyed them in the open sea, but it requires careful excavation to remove without damaging what lies beneath. The visibility in the lagoon is poor, limited by the fine particles of sediment that remain suspended in the water for long periods after disturbance, and the work of excavating and recording an archaeological site in conditions of low visibility at depths of 3 to 5 meters requires specialized equipment and techniques that were developed specifically for this kind of environment. The history of Thonis-Heracleion as a functioning city spans roughly 1,000 years, from approximately the 7th century before the Common Era to the period following 800, and across that millennium it played several distinct roles in the wider history of Egypt and the Mediterranean world. The earliest evidence for substantial settlement at the site dates to the 7th and 6th centuries before the Common Era, a period of significant contact between Egypt and the Greek world. Greek merchants and mercenaries had been present in Egypt from at least the 7th century, and the pharaohs of the late period had actively encouraged Greek settlement and trade as a source of economic activity and military manpower. The establishment of the trading colony at Naucratis, further up the delta, is the most famous example of this policy, but Thonis-Heracleion, sitting at the mouth of the main navigable branch of the Nile, was the point of entry for the Greek presence in Egypt, the place where ships arriving from the Aegean first touched Egyptian soil, where their cargo was inspected and taxed, and where the merchants who wished to trade further into Egypt had to register and obtain permission. This function as the gateway to Egypt gave Thonis-Heracleion a specific institutional character. It was not simply a trading post but an administrative center, a place where the authority of the Egyptian state was exercised over the flow of goods and people entering the country from the sea. The inscriptions found at the site, including a decree of the pharaoh Nectanebo I from the 4th century before the Common Era, show that the city had a formal role in the collection of import taxes, with a tithe of all goods entering Egypt through the port directed to the temple of the local god. This combination of commercial function and religious authority was characteristic of major Egyptian sanctuaries throughout the period, and the temple at Thonis-Heracleion was one of the most important in the Delta region. The temple of the local god, known to the Egyptians as Ammonius Jerub and identified by the Greeks with Heracles, was the spiritual heart of the city and the institutional anchor of its administrative function. It was a large structure, built and rebuilt over several centuries, and the objects recovered from it by underwater archaeologists give a sense of both its religious importance and the wealth that flowed through it. The colossal statues that stood at its entrance, including a granite figure of a pharaoh and a companion figure now believed to represent a queen or goddess, were among the largest monumental sculptures in the Delta region. The bronze and gold votives deposited in the sacred precinct by worshippers from across the Mediterranean world testify to the international reach of the cult practiced here and to the significance of the site as a place of religious pilgrimage as well as commercial transit. The Persian conquest of Egypt in 525 before the Common Era did not interrupt the functioning of Thonis-Heracleion. The Persians, like the pharaohs before them, recognized the economic importance of the port and maintained its administrative function, adapting the existing institutional structures to the requirements of the Persian imperial system. The site continued to develop through the period of Persian rule, and the evidence from the archaeology suggests that the construction of major religious and civic structures continued through the 5th and 4th centuries before the Common Era. The arrival of Alexander the Great in Egypt in 332 before the Common Era and the subsequent founding of Alexandria transformed the geography of trade and administration in the Delta region. Alexandria, built on the coast west of the main Nile mouth, gradually assumed the commercial and administrative functions that had previously been concentrated at Thonis-Heracleion and Naucratis. The new city's deep harbor, its direct access to the sea, and the investment of enormous resources in its development by the Ptolemaic dynasty that ruled Egypt after Alexander's death made it the dominant port of the eastern Mediterranean within a generation of its founding. Thonis-Heracleion did not disappear immediately, but its relative importance declined steadily as Alexandria grew, and the city that had been the gateway to Egypt for centuries became progressively less central to the commercial and administrative life of the Delta region. The underwater archaeology of Thonis-Heracleion is one of the most remarkable scientific enterprises of the past quarter century, a sustained effort to recover and understand a major ancient city from beneath 3 to 5 meters of water and sediment in conditions that required the development of entirely new methods of excavation and recording. The discovery of the site by the European Institute for Underwater Archaeology, led by the French archaeologist Franck Gaudiot, in the years around 2000 was not the result of a chance find but of a systematic survey of the Bay of Abu Qir using geophysical prospection methods adapted from the oil and gas industry. Side-scan sonar, which produces images of the sea floor by measuring the reflection of acoustic pulses, was used to identify anomalies in the flat sediment surface of the lagoon that might indicate buried structures. Sub-bottom profiling, which sends acoustic pulses into the sediment and measures their reflection from interfaces between layers of different density, was used to determine the depth and extent of buried archaeological deposits. The combination of these methods produced a detailed picture of the underwater topography of the bay and identified the locations of the most promising areas for excavation before a single dive had been made. The initial excavations confirmed that the geophysical surveys had been accurate. At the location identified as the most promising by the sonar data, divers found the remains of a major ancient city lying beneath a layer of sediment that had accumulated over more than 1,000 years of submersion. The scale of what they found was staggering. Not the scattered remains of a small settlement or a handful of isolated structures, but the coherent urban fabric of a substantial city, with temple foundations and harbor installations and public monuments and the accumulated material of centuries of intensive occupation all preserved beneath the mud of the Egyptian lagoon. The objects recovered from the site in the years since the initial discovery have transformed the understanding of the city and of the broader history of the Delta region. The colossal statues, some of them more than 5 meters tall, were raised from the seafloor using flotation bags and cradles especially designed for the purpose, their surfaces still bearing traces of the paint and gilding that had decorated them when they stood at the entrance to the temple more than 2,000 years ago. The inscribed steels, some of them still standing upright in the sediment exactly as they had been placed when the city was functioning, were raised and conserved and read, yielding texts that have added directly to the historical record of the late period of ancient Egyptian history. The bronze figurines, the faience amulets, the gold jewelry, the lead weights, and the ceramic vessels. Each category of object adds a different dimension to the picture of life in the ancient city. The process of recording the spatial relationships of objects before their recovery from the seafloor is one of the most technically demanding aspects of the excavation, because the poor visibility in the lagoon and the physical constraints of working in 3 to 5 meters of water make the application of conventional archaeological recording methods impossible. The team developed a system of underwater mapping that combined measurements made by divers with the data from acoustic positioning systems that tracked the location of divers and equipment across the site to within centimeter accuracy, producing a spatial record of the excavation that meets the standards of modern archaeological practice despite the exceptional difficulty of the working conditions. The result is a database of object locations and stratigraphic relationships that allows the spatial analysis of the site to be conducted on land, after the excavation, using the same methods that would be applied to any well-documented land excavation. The harbour of Thonis-Heracleion, identified in the underwater survey as a large basin on the northern side of the city, has yielded a collection of ancient ships and their cargoes that is unique in Mediterranean underwater archaeology. More than 60 ancient vessels have been identified within the harbor area, ranging from large seagoing ships to the smaller flat-bottomed craft that would have been used for movement within the lagoon. The anchors of these ships, hundreds of them, lie in the sediment in the positions where they were dropped when the ships moored in the harbor, and the distribution of these anchors across the harbor basin gives a precise picture of how the harbor was organized and used in the ancient period. The objects recovered from Thonis-Heracleion speak, in the aggregate, of a city that was genuinely international in character, a place where the material culture of Egypt and of Greece and of the wider Mediterranean world existed side by side and intermingled in ways that reflect the specific role of the port as a meeting point between different trading and cultural traditions. The Egyptian character of the city is most visible in its monumental religious architecture and in the official inscriptions that record the decrees of the pharaohs. The statues that stood at the entrance to the main temple are in the canonical tradition of Egyptian royal and divine sculpture, massive and formal and oriented toward the eternal in the way that all great Egyptian religious art is oriented. The steles that recorded the decrees of the pharaohs are in the tradition of official Egyptian epigraphy, their texts composed in hieroglyphic and demotic script and directed at the religious and administrative institutions of the Egyptian state. The temple itself, insofar as its plan can be reconstructed from the foundations and the scattered architectural elements that have been recovered from the seafloor, was organized according to the conventions of Egyptian sacred architecture that had been established over centuries and that were maintained throughout the period of the city's operation. The Greek character of the city is visible in a different range of material. In the ceramic vessels imported from the Aegean and from the Greek cities of the eastern Mediterranean, in the bronze figurines in the Greek style that were deposited as votive offerings in the sacred precinct alongside offerings in the Egyptian style, and in the inscriptions in Greek that have been found among the recovered material. The presence of a Greek temple or sanctuary within or adjacent to the main Egyptian sacred precinct is suggested by some of the architectural evidence, and the practice of religious syncretism, the identification of Greek gods with their Egyptian equivalents and the worship of both traditions within the same sacred space, seems to have been central to the religious life of the city. The material from other parts of the ancient Mediterranean world that has been found at Thonis-Heracleion extends the picture further. Phoenician and Cypriot vessels, objects of Levantine origin, and material that may have come from even further afield through the long-distance trading networks of the ancient Mediterranean all appear in the archaeological record of the site. The The city was not simply a Greek-Egyptian interface but a genuinely multilateral commercial and cultural meeting point, a place where the goods and the gods and the people of the wider ancient world converged and interacted. The lead weights recovered from the harbor area are among the most practically informative objects from the site. Weights are the material evidence of commercial transactions, the tools that merchants used to measure the goods they were buying and selling, and the collection of weights from Thonis-Heracleion includes examples made to the standards used in Egypt, in the Aegean Greek cities, and in the Phoenician commercial system. The presence of weights from multiple different metrological systems within the same harbor indicates that the merchants who operated there were accustomed to trading across cultural and commercial boundaries, and that the port had developed the institutional arrangements, the exchange rates, the conversion tables, the bilingual officials, necessary to facilitate transactions between parties using different commercial standards. The religious life of Thonis-Heracleion was organized around the main temple and the cult of the god worshipped there, but it extended well beyond the precinct of the main temple to encompass a network of smaller sanctuaries and religious installations distributed across the city and its surrounding waters. The naos of the decades, a portable shrine of black granite found at the site, is one of the most important single objects recovered from Thonis-Heracleion, both for its artistic quality and for what it reveals about the religious life of the city. Portable shrines of this kind were used in the religious processions that were a central feature of Egyptian religious practice, carried through the streets and along the waterways of Egyptian cities during the festivals of the gods. The presence of such a shrine at Thonis-Heracleion places the city within the network of Egyptian religious practice and confirms that the ceremonial life of the major Egyptian sanctuaries was observed here as it was at the great temples further up the Nile. The canopic jars and the assemblages of ritual objects found in the sacred precinct give a further picture of the religious practices conducted at the site. The offering of small bronze figurines representing gods and sacred animals was a common form of votive practice in Egyptian temples of the late period, and the collection of such objects from Thonis-Heracleion is large and varied, including representations of the principal gods of the Egyptian pantheon as well as the more specific divine figures associated with the particular cults of the Delta region. The presence of Osiris imagery is especially significant, given the close association of Osiris with the Nile and with the cycles of agricultural renewal that were central to the religious experience of the Delta. The Greek religious presence at Thonis-Heracleion is documented not only by the material finds but by the textual record. The Greek geographer Strabo, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, mentions a temple of Heracles at the place called Heracleion, and the identification of this temple with the main sanctuary of the Egyptian site has been confirmed by the archaeological evidence. The Greek practice of identifying their own gods with their Egyptian equivalents, a process the Greeks called interpretation, meant that the temple of the Egyptian god was also a temple of Heracles in the understanding of the Greek merchants and sailors who passed through the port, and that the rituals conducted there were meaningful to both communities. The evidence for religious practice in the harbor area itself is one of the more unexpected discoveries of the underwater excavation. Large quantities of ritual objects, including ceramic vessels that appear to have been used in religious ceremonies and then deliberately deposited in the water, have been found in specific locations within the harbor basin. The practice of making votive deposits in water, of throwing offerings into rivers and lakes and the sea as acts of religious devotion, was widespread in the ancient Mediterranean world, and the harbor of Thonis-Heracleion appears to have been a significant site for this kind of practice. The objects deposited in the harbor water were not simply debris from the city's occupation but deliberate religious acts, gifts to the gods of the sea and the river from the merchants and sailors who depended on their protection. The religious geography of the city extended beyond its own boundaries into the surrounding lagoon, where the evidence of underwater survey suggests the presence of smaller sanctuaries and cult installations on islands and at specific points along the lagoon margins. The processional routes that connected the main temple with these outlying sanctuaries would have been one of the defining features of the ceremonial life of the city, and the movement of the sacred bark, the boat in which the god's image was transported during religious festivals across the waters of the lagoon would have been among the most spectacular events in the annual religious calendar. The inscriptions found at Thonis-Heracleion are among the most historically significant documents to emerge from the underwater excavations, providing direct textual evidence for the administrative and religious functions of the city in its final centuries of operation. The most important of these is the stele of Nectanebo I, a large granite slab inscribed in hieroglyphic and demotic script with a decree of the pharaoh that dates to the 4th century before the Common Era. The decree establishes the tax arrangements for the port of Thonis, stipulating that 1/10 of the taxes collected on all Greek merchandise imported through the port should be directed to the temple of the local god. The existence of this decree, and its placement in a prominent public location within the sacred precinct, tells us several things. That the port was a significant source of revenue for the Egyptian state, that the temple was the institutional beneficiary of a substantial portion of that revenue, and that the relationship between commercial taxation and religious endowment that characterized the economy of major Egyptian sanctuaries was fully operational at Thonis-Heracleion. The significance of the Nectanebo decree extends beyond the specific administrative arrangements it records to illuminate the broader relationship between the Egyptian pharaonic state and the international commercial traffic that passed through its ports. The decree is not simply a tax regulation but a statement of the relationship between the authority of the state, the institutions of the temple, and the commercial activities of foreign merchants that characterized the economy of the late-period Delta cities. The pharaoh's ability to direct a portion of the tax revenues from foreign trade to the temple of the local god was simultaneously an act of religious piety, an acknowledgement of the god's role in protecting the commercial traffic that generated those revenues, and a practical mechanism for funding the religious institutions whose authority legitimized the pharaoh's own power. The three elements, commercial revenue, royal authority, and divine sanction, were inseparable in the institutional logic of the late-period Egyptian state, and the Nectanebo decree from Thonis-Heracleion is one of the clearest surviving expressions of that logic. A companion inscription, a stele that is virtually identical in its text and format to the Nectanebo stele, was found not at Thonis-Heracleion but at Naucratis, the Greek trading colony further up the delta. The near identity of the two inscriptions suggests that they were produced as part of a single administrative act, the implementation of a policy that applied to both of the major ports through which Greek trade entered Egypt, and that the relationship between the two sites was understood by the pharaonic administration as a coordinated system rather than two independent entities. The discovery of the Thonis-Heracleion stele in 2000 resolved a long-standing question about the location of the city and confirmed that the Naucratis and Thonis decrees were the twin pillars of a unified policy of regulating Greek commercial access to Egypt. The stele of the satrap Ptolemy, found at the site and dating to the period immediately following the death of Alexander the Great, records a donation of land to the temple of the local god by the Macedonian satrap who governed Egypt in the years before the establishment of the Ptolemaic dynasty. This document is significant for several reasons. It shows that the Macedonian rulers of Egypt maintained the administrative relationship between the port and the temple that had been established by the pharaohs, and it provides evidence for the continued operation of the site in the early Hellenistic period despite the growing importance of Alexandria. The fact that the satrap chose to record his donation at Thonis-Heracleion rather than at one of the more central sites of the Egyptian cult suggests that the city still commanded sufficient religious prestige to make its temple a worthwhile beneficiary of royal generosity. The bilingual character of many of the inscriptions found at the site, texts presented in both Egyptian script and in Greek, reflects the bilingual administrative reality of the city in its later centuries of operation. The need to communicate with both the Egyptian priestly and administrative establishment and the Greek-speaking mercantile community that used the port drove the production of texts in both languages, and the combination of hieroglyphic and demotic Egyptian with the Greek alphabet on the same monument is a physical expression of the cultural meaning that Thonis-Heracleion embodied throughout its history. The decline and eventual submersion of Thonis-Heracleion was not a single event but a process, and the archaeological evidence from the site allows that process to be reconstructed in some detail, even if the precise sequence and timing of events remains a matter of ongoing scholarly investigation. The founding of Alexandria in 331 before the Common Era is the most significant external factor in the decline of Thonis-Heracleion, though the effects of Alexandria's rise took time to manifest and were probably not felt immediately in the life of the port. The Ptolemaic kings invested heavily in Alexandria from the beginning, building the harbor infrastructure, the lighthouse, the library, and the administrative institutions that made it the greatest city in the Hellenistic world within a few generations. The commercial and administrative functions that had previously been distributed between Thonis-Heracleion and Naucrates were progressively concentrated in the new capital, and the role of the older ports was reduced accordingly. By the time the Roman Emperor Augustus conquered Egypt in 30 before the Common Era and made it a province of the Roman Empire, Alexandria was overwhelmingly the dominant center of the Delta region, and the other ports of the Delta coast had been reduced to secondary importance. The geological processes that eventually destroyed Thonis-Heracleion were not a sudden catastrophe but a gradual deterioration that accelerated as the maintenance of the urban infrastructure that had kept the island above water was reduced and eventually ceased. The island on which the city stood was maintained at habitable level by a combination of ongoing construction that raised the level of built surfaces above the slowly sinking ground, and by the active management of the drainage and water channels that controlled the relationship between the land surface and the surrounding lagoon. As the city declined in commercial and administrative importance, the investment of resources in this maintenance declined with it, and the island began the slow process of reversion to the unstable sedimentary base on which it had always rested. The trigger for the most rapid phase of the submersion may have been one or more episodes of ground liquefaction, the process by which saturated sediment loses its structural integrity when subjected to mechanical disturbance, most commonly the shaking of an earthquake. The Mediterranean region is seismically active, and the coastal delta region of Egypt has experienced significant earthquakes throughout its recorded history. A major seismic event affecting the already compromised sedimentary foundation of the island could have precipitated the kind of rapid structural failure that would account for the relatively intact but clearly collapsed state of many of the buildings at the site, structures that appear to have fallen rather than been dismantled or eroded in place. The physical evidence from the underwater excavation supports a picture of a city that was partially inhabited until relatively close to the time of its final submersion, not an already abandoned ruin when the critical failure occurred. Objects dating to the later Roman period have been found at the site, indicating continued use of at least some parts of the city well into the Common Era, and the presence of intact assemblages of material in what appear to have been storage or domestic contexts suggests that the final submersion was sudden enough that there was no time for the systematic removal of portable valuables before the city went under. The story of how Thonis-Heracleion was found is inseparable from the story of how underwater archaeology developed as a scientific discipline, and the work at the site has both benefited from and contributed to the technical advances that have made the recovery of submerged ancient cities possible. Underwater archaeology as a serious scientific discipline is relatively young, with the systematic excavation and recording of submerged sites developing primarily in the second half of the 20th century. The early history of the field was dominated by the recovery of spectacular objects from Mediterranean shipwrecks, work that was important for what it revealed about ancient trade and material culture, but that often lacked the systematic recording and contextual documentation that characterizes modern archaeological practice. The shift toward more rigorous methodology, toward the application of the same standards of excavation and recording that governed work on land sites to the challenging environment of underwater excavation, has been the major development of the field over the past half-century. The team that discovered and has been excavating Thonis-Heracleion has been a significant contributor to this methodological development. The use of geophysical prospection methods to locate and characterize the site before excavation began established a model for the systematic approach to underwater survey that has since been applied to sites across the Mediterranean and beyond. The development of recording methods that could capture the spatial relationships of objects and structures in the poor visibility conditions of the lagoon, using techniques adapted from industrial inspection and from the spatial documentation methods of land archaeology, produced a standard of contextual documentation that had rarely been achieved in previous underwater excavation. The use of nuclear magnetic resonance scanning to analyze the sediments within and around the site has provided information about the geological history of the island and the processes that led to its submersion that could not have been obtained from the physical excavation alone. This non-invasive approach to the investigation of buried sites, which can characterize the composition and layering of sediments without the need for excavation, has significant implications for the future of both underwater and land-based archaeology, allowing the investigation of buried landscapes at a scale and with a precision that excavation alone cannot achieve. The development of photogrammetry as a recording tool for underwater archaeology has been one of the most significant technical advances applied to the Thonis-Heracleion excavation. Photogrammetric techniques, which use overlapping photographs to construct three-dimensional models of objects and surfaces, can be applied underwater using standard dive cameras equipped with appropriate lighting, and the resulting models can be processed on land to produce millimeter-accurate records of the form and condition of objects before their recovery. The application of this technique to the colossal statues and the architectural elements at the site has produced a digital archive of the pre-recovery condition of these objects that will be invaluable for future conservation and research, and that documents the underwater context of the finds in a way that no amount of written description could replicate. The Egyptian government's involvement in the project, through the Supreme Council of Antiquities and its successor bodies, has been central to the legal and institutional framework within which the excavation has operated. The underwater cultural heritage of Egypt is protected by national legislation that requires all excavation to be conducted under permit and in partnership with Egyptian institutions, and the collaborative framework established for the Thonis-Heracleion excavation has become a model for the management of underwater heritage sites in the region. The training of Egyptian underwater archaeologists through the project has also built the national capacity for the long-term management and investigation of the country's underwater cultural heritage, which extends well beyond the Bay of Abu Qir to include sites along the entire Egyptian Mediterranean coast and in the Nile itself. The conservation of the objects recovered from Thonis-Heracleion is a scientific enterprise in its own right, requiring the application of specialized techniques to materials that have spent more than 1,000 years in the corrosive environment of salt water. Stone objects, including the colossal statues and the inscribed steels, require relatively straightforward conservation treatment after recovery. Cleaning to remove the concretions of marine organisms and mineral deposits that have formed on their surfaces, stabilization of any active deterioration, and the controlled drying that allows the stone to adjust to the different humidity conditions of the storage and display environment without cracking or flaking. The granite and limestone of the Egyptian monumental sculptures are durable materials that have survived the conditions of the lagoon in relatively good condition, and the primary challenge in their conservation is the removal of the surface deposits that obscure their original form and inscription without damaging the surfaces beneath. Metal objects, and particularly the bronze figurines and fittings that make up a significant proportion of the recovered material, present more complex conservation challenges. Bronze in saltwater undergoes a process of corrosion that replaces the original metal with a layer of copper chloride compounds, and this corrosion layer, while preserving the general form of the object, can be actively unstable in the different chemical environment of the atmosphere. The conservation treatment of bronze objects from marine contexts requires the removal of the active chloride compounds, a process that can take months or years for large objects, followed by stabilization with chemical consolidants and the application of protective coatings that prevent the recurrence of active corrosion. The bronze objects from Thonis-Heracleion, including some of the finest small-scale sculptures of the Egyptian late period, have required extensive conservation treatment before they could be safely studied or displayed. Organic materials, including wood, rope, textile, and basketry, survive in underwater conditions only in the absence of oxygen, and the anaerobic environment of the fine-grained sediment that covers the site has preserved some organic remains that would have disappeared completely in the open air. The waterlogged wood of the ancient ships, for example, retains its original form, while the wood fibers have been replaced by water and by the microorganisms that break down organic material in anaerobic conditions. The conservation of waterlogged wood requires a slow and controlled replacement of the water within the wood fibers with a consolidant, most commonly a wax or polymer, that supports the structure of the wood as it dries. This process can take many years for large structural timbers, and the conservation of the ancient ships from Thonis-Heracleion represents a decades-long commitment of resources and expertise. The ceramics from the site, while less technically challenging to conserve than the metals and organics, provide some of the most important chronological and commercial information about the city's history. The identification of pottery types by their clay composition, their surface treatment, and their vessel form allows archaeologists to determine both the date of their production and the region from which they were imported, building up a picture of the trading connections of the city through the material evidence of its everyday commercial life. The ceramic sequence from Thonis-Heracleion spans the entire period of the city's occupation and provides a continuous chronological framework against which the other evidence from the site can be measured. The broader historical significance of Thonis-Heracleion extends well beyond the specific archaeology of the site to illuminate the larger story of the relationship between Egypt and the Greek world in the first millennium before the Common Era. The period during which Thonis-Heracleion was at its most active, the 6th through 4th centuries before the Common Era, was a period of intense and transformative contact between the ancient Mediterranean world and Egypt. The Greek colonies on the Egyptian coast, the presence of Greek mercenaries in the Egyptian army, the trade in Egyptian grain that sustained the cities of the Aegean, the influence of Egyptian religion and art on the developing traditions of the Greek world. All of these dimensions of the relationship between the two cultures flowed through or were mediated by the ports of the Delta region, and Thonis-Heracleion was the most important of these ports. The philosophical and religious influence of Egypt on the Greek world is a contested topic in classical scholarship, but the physical evidence from sites like Thonis-Heracleion provides a material foundation for thinking about how this influence was transmitted. The presence of Greek religious practice within the context of an Egyptian sanctuary, the identification of Greek and Egyptian gods with each other, the mixing of Greek and Egyptian votive practices in the same sacred precinct. These are not simply textual assertions but physical realities documented in the archaeological record of the site. The processes of cultural exchange that produced the syncretic religious culture of the Hellenistic period did not begin with Alexander the Great, but had roots in the sustained commercial and cultural contact of the preceding centuries, and the ports of the Delta were where much of that contact took place. The evidence from Thonis-Heracleion for the administrative structures of the late-period pharaonic state adds another dimension to the historical significance of the site. The inscriptions that record the tax decrees of the pharaohs, the physical infrastructure of the harbor and the customs facilities, the administrative buildings and storage facilities that have been identified in the underwater survey. Together, these paint a picture of a sophisticated fiscal and administrative apparatus that was capable of managing the flow of international trade through one of the most important commercial nodes in the ancient Mediterranean world. The sophistication of this apparatus and its ability to function continuously through multiple changes of political regime from the native Egyptian pharaohs through the Persians and the Macedonians is a testament to the institutional continuity of the Egyptian state across the turbulent political history of the late period. The role of the temple in this administrative structure is one of the most interesting aspects of the Thonis-Heracleion evidence. The direction of a portion of the tax revenues from the port to the temple, as established by the Nectanebo decree, was not simply an act of religious piety but an institutional arrangement that gave the temple a material stake in the management of the commercial traffic through the port. The temple was not just the spiritual center of the city but a major economic actor, and the wealth accumulated through its share of the port revenues funded the construction and maintenance of the monumental religious complex that was the most visible expression of the city's importance. The shipwrecks of Thonis-Heracleion constitute one of the largest and most important collections of ancient watercraft ever found in a single location, and their study has transformed the understanding of ancient Mediterranean shipbuilding and of the commercial infrastructure of the ancient Delta region. The more than 60 vessels identified within the harbor area range in date from the 6th century before the Common Era to the Islamic period, spanning most of the operational history of the port. The earlier vessels, those dating to the period of the city's greatest commercial activity, are the most significant for the understanding of ancient shipbuilding, as they include examples of construction techniques that were not previously documented in the archaeological record. Some of the vessels appear to combine features of the Greek and Egyptian shipbuilding traditions in ways that suggest they were built locally, in the Delta region, by craftsmen who were familiar with both traditions and who adapted them to the specific requirements of navigation in the shallow lagoon waters. The flat-bottomed vessels, designed for movement within the lagoon rather than for open-sea voyaging, are particularly informative about the commercial infrastructure of the ancient delta. The lagoon was not simply a backdrop to the city but an active commercial space, crisscrossed by the small boats that carried goods between the deep-water anchorage at Thonis-Heracleion and the other settlements around the lagoon margins, and between the lagoon and the main branches of the Nile that provided access to the interior of Egypt. The flat-bottomed craft that served this inland trade were a distinct category of vessel from the seagoing ships that crossed the Mediterranean, and the collection from Thonis-Heracleion provides the most detailed evidence yet obtained for this important but poorly documented category of ancient watercraft. The anchors associated with the vessels in the harbor are, taken together, a remarkable collection of ancient maritime hardware. Stone anchors, lead-stocked wooden anchors, and iron anchors span the entire chronological range of the harbor's operation and provide a continuous record of the development of anchor technology in the ancient Mediterranean. The distribution of anchors within the harbor basin, which can be read as a record of the mooring positions of vessels over centuries of use, gives a detailed picture of how the harbor was organized and managed in different periods of the city's history. The concentration of anchors in specific areas of the harbor suggests the existence of designated mooring zones for different categories of vessel, an arrangement consistent with the documentary evidence for the regulated management of the commercial traffic through the port. The cargo assemblages associated with some of the vessels are among the most informative objects from the entire excavation. Ceramic transport vessels, lead weights, stone anchors, and the various fittings of the ships themselves have been found in contexts that allow them to be associated with specific vessels and therefore interpreted as evidence of the trading activities of those vessels at the time of their final mooring or sinking. The range of origins represented in these cargo assemblages, from Aegean Greece to Cyprus to the Levantine coast and to Egypt itself, gives a vivid picture of the commercial reach of the port and of the diversity of the trading networks that converged on Thonis-Heracleion in the centuries of its greatest activity. The questions that the archaeology of Thonis-Heracleion raises about the end of the city are among the most difficult that the evidence poses, because the processes that destroyed it operated over a long period and left physical traces that are not always easy to interpret. The abandonment of the city and its eventual submersion were not instantaneous events but processes that unfolded over centuries, and the distinction between the gradual commercial decline that reduced the city from a major port to a secondary one and the physical deterioration that eventually sent the buildings and monuments into the lagoon is not always clear in the archaeological record. Objects of later date, from the Roman and early Byzantine periods, have been found in the upper layers of the sediment deposits at the site, suggesting that the city retained some population and some level of activity well after the founding of Alexandria had begun its commercial decline. But the character of this later occupation, whether it was a substantial urban community or a reduced settlement maintaining only the most essential functions of the original city, is not yet well understood. The evidence for ground failure, the process by which the saturated sediment beneath the city lost its structural integrity and allowed the buildings above it to collapse and sink, is visible in the tilted and fallen state of many of the larger structures at the site. Statues that once stood upright now lie on their sides. Walls that were vertical are now inclined at angles that indicate the differential subsidence of the ground beneath them. Architectural elements that were once part of coherent structures are now scattered across the sea floor in patterns that suggest they fell rather than were deposited. This physical evidence of structural failure is consistent with the hypothesis of ground liquefaction triggered by seismic activity, but it does not definitively establish this as the mechanism, and the question of whether the final phase of submersion was rapid or gradual, earthquake-triggered, or simply the culmination of a slow process of deterioration remains open. The survival of objects in contexts that suggest they were in use at the time of submersion, rather than having been collected and stored for safekeeping before the expected end of occupation, is one of the most intriguing aspects of the site. Assemblages of ceramic vessels in what appear to have been domestic or commercial contexts, religious objects in positions consistent with active cult use rather than storage or disposal, and the general impression of a city that was functioning up to the moment of its submersion rather than being systematically cleared before abandonment. All of this suggests that the final submersion, whenever and however it occurred, was not an anticipated event that the remaining inhabitants had time to prepare for. The comparison with other submerged ancient sites in the same coastal region is instructive. The underwater survey of the Bay of Abu Qir has identified the remains of several other ancient settlements in addition to Thonis-Heracleion, all of them sharing the basic characteristics of being built on unstable delta sediment, and all of them having eventually succumbed to the same combination of subsidence and sea level rise that destroyed the main city. The submersion of Thonis-Heracleion was therefore not an exceptional event caused by a unique combination of circumstances, but an instance of a general pattern that affected the entire coastal delta region during the first millennium of the Common Era. The display and interpretation of the objects recovered from Thonis-Heracleion has presented opportunities and challenges that are specific to the nature of the site and its underwater context. The scale and quality of the finds from the site have made them the subject of major international exhibitions, most notably the traveling exhibition that displayed objects from both Thonis-Heracleion and the nearby submerged city of Canopus under the title Sunken Civilizations. This exhibition, which traveled to major museums in Europe, North America, and Australia between 2006 and the present, brought the discoveries from the underwater excavation to a global audience and established the site as one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the early 21st century. The experience of seeing colossal ancient sculptures that were recovered from beneath the sea, their surfaces bearing the marks of 12 centuries of underwater deposition, in the context of a major museum installation has proved to be one of the most powerful ways of communicating the significance of underwater archaeology to audiences who would never have the opportunity to see the actual site. The impact of these exhibitions on public awareness of underwater archaeology and of the specific significance of Thonis-Heracleion has been substantial. Attendance figures at the major venues where the Sunken Civilizations exhibition was shown indicate that the material attracted audiences comparable to those drawn by the most popular exhibitions of well-known ancient civilizations, a measure of the degree to which the story of the underwater discovery resonated with a broad public beyond the specialist audiences that normally attend exhibitions of ancient Egyptian material. The combination of spectacular objects, a compelling discovery narrative, and the relevance of the site story to contemporary questions about sea level rise and coastal vulnerability gave the exhibition an accessibility and a contemporary relevance that exhibitions of more conventional archaeological material often lack. The challenge of displaying underwater finds in a way that communicates the context of their discovery, the site from which they came and the conditions under which they were found and recovered, is one that the exhibitions of Thonis-Heracleion material have addressed in different ways. The use of photographs and film of the underwater excavation, projected alongside the objects themselves, attempts to bridge the gap between the object in the museum case and the environment in which it lay for 12 centuries. The digital reconstructions of the ancient city, which used the spatial data from the underwater survey to create three-dimensional models of the urban layout as it might have appeared in the period of the city's greatest activity, provide a framework for understanding the individual objects in relation to the larger ensemble from which they came. The permanent display of some of the most significant objects from the site in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo and in the Alexandria National Museum provides a context for the material within Egypt itself, and the development of an underwater museum or marine protected area at the site of the excavation, which has been discussed as a long-term goal of the project, would allow visitors to experience the submerged city in its actual underwater setting. The technology of underwater tourism, including glass-bottomed boats, submarine vessels, and full diving access for qualified visitors, has been developed at several other underwater heritage sites around the Mediterranean, and the application of these approaches at Thonis-Heracleion would make the site accessible to a wider audience without the need to remove every significant object from its underwater context. The excavation of Thonis-Heracleion is far from complete, and the ongoing work at the site continues to yield discoveries that refine and sometimes fundamentally revise the understanding of the city and its place in the ancient world. Recent seasons of excavation have expanded the known footprint of the city significantly, identifying areas of occupation and harbor infrastructure that were not apparent in the initial surveys. The discovery of a large temple of unknown dedication in the southeastern part of the site has added a new dimension to the understanding of the city's religious topography and the objects associated with it, including a collection of bronze ritual vessels and a group of Greek and Egyptian votive figurines, suggest a history of use that extends well into the Ptolemaic and possibly the Roman period. The continued expansion of the known area of the site suggests that Thonis-Heracleion was substantially larger than the initial surveys had indicated, and that the full extent of the ancient city has not yet been determined. The investigation of the harbor area continues to produce significant results. New vessels are identified in almost every season of excavation, and the detailed study of the hull remains and the associated cargo and equipment is producing a picture of ancient shipbuilding and commercial practice that is without parallel in the archaeological record. The identification of what appears to be a shipyard or boat repair facility in one area of the harbor has opened a new line of investigation into the maintenance of the commercial fleet that operated out of the port, and the evidence from this area is beginning to illuminate the practical organization of the commercial life of the city in ways that were not previously accessible from the textual record. The scientific study of the environmental context of the site, the sediment sequences and the biological remains and the geochemical signatures that record the environmental history of the lagoon across the period of the city's occupation, is producing a detailed picture of the environmental changes that accompanied the city's decline and submersion. The combination of this environmental data with the archaeological sequence from the excavation is allowing archaeologists to develop a much more precise account of the timing and mechanism of the submersion than was previously possible. And the results of this work are relevant not only for the understanding of Thonis-Heracleion, but for the broader question of how ancient coastal settlements in the Delta region responded to the environmental pressures that eventually overwhelmed them. The future of the excavation at Thonis-Heracleion faces the same challenges that confront all long-term archaeological projects: the need for sustained funding, the development and retention of specialized expertise, and the management of the relationship between scientific excavation and the conservation and public presentation of the results. The site is large and complex, and the full investigation of what it contains will require many more decades of work. The commitment of the institutions and the individuals who have sustained the project through its first quarter-century gives grounds for confidence that this work will continue, and that the understanding of Thonis-Heracleion will continue to deepen as the excavation proceeds. The relationship between Thonis-Heracleion and the other cities of the ancient Delta region is an important context for understanding the site, and the underwater survey of the Bay of Abu Qir has provided important new information about this relationship. The ancient delta was densely settled, with cities and towns and villages and sanctuaries distributed across the network of river channels and lagoon margins that constituted the landscape of the region. The major settlements were connected to each other and to the Nile by a system of canals and channels that allowed the movement of goods and people across what was, in the ancient period, a largely water-based landscape. The movement of agricultural produce from the fields of the delta to the storage facilities of the major cities, and from there to the ships waiting in the harbor at Thonis-Heracleion, was one of the fundamental economic processes of the region, and the infrastructure that supported this movement, the canals, the quays, the warehouses, was as important as the harbor itself. The city of Naucrates, The Greek trading colony established in the delta in the 7th century before the Common Era stands in a particularly close relationship to Thonis-Heracleion. The two cities were connected by the Nile and by the administrative decree that treated them as the twin gateways of Greek commercial access to Egypt. A merchant arriving at Thonis-Heracleion from the Aegean would have obtained the necessary permissions and paid the required taxes, and then moved up the river to Naucratis to conduct the actual commercial transactions that were the purpose of the voyage. The relationship between the two cities was therefore complementary rather than competitive, with each performing a different function within the overall system of regulated Greek trade with Egypt. The city of Canopus, whose remains have also been investigated by the underwater archaeology team working in the Bay of Abu Qir, was another major settlement in the same coastal lagoon system. Canopus is mentioned by several ancient writers as an important city and religious center, associated in particular with the cult of the god Serapis, the syncretic deity whose worship was one of the most successful religious innovations of the Ptolemaic period. The physical remains of Canopus lie a few kilometers to the east of Thonis-Heracleion in the same underwater landscape, and the investigation of the two sites together has provided a picture of the urban and commercial geography of the ancient lagoon that neither site could have provided in isolation. The network of smaller sanctuaries and cultic installations distributed around the lagoon margins, identified through underwater survey but not yet fully excavated, adds further texture to the picture of the ancient landscape. The ancient Egyptians organized their sacred geography through a system of processional routes and cultic relationships that connected major temples to subsidiary sanctuaries across the landscape, and the evidence from the Bay of Abu Qir suggests that Thonis-Heracleion was the center of a larger cultic network that extended across the western delta region, linking the major sanctuary at the port to outlying cult places through the waterways that connected the lagoon to the Nile and to the open sea. The investigation of the relationship between Thonis-Heracleion and the broader network of delta settlements is one of the most productive areas of current research, as it allows the site to be understood not as an isolated anomaly but as the dominant node in an interconnected urban and commercial system. The canal networks that connected the major settlements of the delta, the movement of agricultural produce from the fields to the storage facilities at the ports, the administrative relationships between the port cities and the pharaonic and later Ptolemaic central government. Understanding these connections is essential for placing the specific evidence from the underwater excavation in the broader context of the ancient landscape that produced it. The story of Thonis-Heracleion resonates with larger themes in the history of ancient cities and of the relationship between human settlement and the natural environment, themes that have acquired new relevance in a period when sea level rise and coastal erosion are reshaping the relationship between contemporary cities and the water that surrounds them. The process that destroyed Thonis-Heracleion, the gradual subsidence of a city built on unstable coastal sediment, combined with a rising sea level and a declining investment in the maintenance of the urban infrastructure that kept the land above water, is a process that has affected many coastal cities across history and that continues to affect cities today. The vulnerability of the Delta region to the same combination of factors is well documented in contemporary environmental science. The Nile Delta is sinking at rates that have been measured and projected, the sea level is rising, and the cities built on the delta sediment are subject to the same fundamental instability that destroyed Thonis-Heracleion 2,000 years ago. The ancient city is, in this sense, a historical case study in the long-term consequences of building in a coastal delta environment, and the lessons of its destruction have a contemporary relevance that goes beyond the purely historical and archaeological. The delta cities of ancient Egypt were not the only coastal settlements in the ancient Mediterranean to face the challenge of building on unstable ground at the water's edge, but they faced it at a particularly large scale and over a particularly long period. The engineering responses developed by the ancient Egyptians for managing the instability of the delta landscape, the use of heavy stone construction that could resist differential ground movement, the maintenance of drainage systems that controlled the water content of the ground beneath the buildings, the ongoing investment in raising the level of built surfaces above the slowly sinking land. These responses reflect a sophisticated practical understanding of the relationship between built structures and the geological conditions beneath them, an understanding that was developed through centuries of experience in a landscape that punished the failure to maintain the infrastructure that kept it habitable. The resilience of the city across more than 1,000 years of operation, despite the inherent instability of its foundations, is equally instructive. The people who built and maintained Thonis-Heracleion developed practical responses to the challenges of building on saturated sediment, the use of construction materials and building methods that could accommodate ground movement without catastrophic failure, the maintenance of drainage systems that kept the land surface above the water table, the ongoing investment in the physical infrastructure that kept the city habitable and functional. These responses were not permanent solutions to the underlying problem, but they were effective over a timescale of centuries, and the period of the city's operation was long enough for it to accumulate the wealth, the institutions, and the cultural significance that make its loss historically significant. The relationship between the city's decline and the environmental deterioration of its physical setting is one of the most interesting aspects of the Thonis-Heracleion evidence. The archaeological and environmental data together suggest that the decline of investment in the maintenance of the urban infrastructure, which was itself a consequence of the city's declining commercial and administrative importance following the rise of Alexandria, accelerated the physical deterioration of the ground beneath the city and brought forward the date of its eventual submersion. The city's fate was therefore not simply the result of natural forces operating independently of human choices, but of an interaction between environmental instability and the human decision to disinvest in the infrastructure that had kept the natural instability at bay. The question of what Thonis-Heracleion tells us about the ancient understanding of the sea and of the relationship between human civilization and the natural world is one that the archaeological evidence can address only obliquely, but it is worth raising because it touches on one of the most fundamental aspects of what it means to build a city at the edge of the water. The people who built Thonis-Heracleion knew that they were building on unstable ground. The evidence of ongoing construction that raised the level of the city above the sinking land, the maintenance of drainage systems that controlled the relationship between the built surface and the surrounding water, the religious practices that invoked the protection of the gods of the sea and the river. All of these things reflect an awareness of the fundamental instability of the environment and a sustained effort to manage that instability. This was not a civilization that ignored the risks of its location, but one that accepted those risks as the price of the advantages that the location offered, and that developed practical and religious responses to the challenges that the location posed. The religious dimension of this relationship is particularly visible at Thonis-Heracleion. The concentration of religious activity at the site, the monumental temples, the votive deposits in the harbor water, the processional routes that connected the main sanctuary to the outlying cultic places in the lagoon, suggests a community that understood its existence as fundamentally dependent on the goodwill of the divine powers that controlled the water. The gods worshipped at Thonis-Heracleion were primarily gods of the river and the sea, of the agricultural fertility that the Nile provided and of the commercial success that depended on safe passage across the Mediterranean. The investment of wealth and attention in the propitiation of these gods was not simply conventional religious practice but a rational response to the practical reality of living in an environment where the benevolence or the hostility of water could determine the difference between prosperity and destruction. The practical dimension of this religious relationship with water is visible in the specific nature of the votive deposits found in the harbor of Thonis-Heracleion. The objects thrown into the harbor water as offerings were not random selections from the material culture of the city but specific categories of object with specific ritual significance. Vessels associated with the pouring of libations, figurines of gods associated with maritime protection, objects connected with the commercial transactions that the harbor facilitated. The practice of harbor votive deposition was therefore not simply a general expression of religious feeling but a targeted ritual response to specific practical concerns, a way of communicating with the divine powers that controlled the conditions, weather, water, commercial fortune, on which the life of the port depended. The ancient harbor cities of the Mediterranean world understood the sea in a way that is different from the way that modern coastal cities understand it. For the ancient world, the sea was not simply a resource or a risk to be managed through engineering, but a domain of divine power that required acknowledgement and propitiation. The religious life of Thonis-Heracleion, with its temples and its votive deposits and its processional routes connecting the human world of the city to the watery world of the lagoon, was not separate from the commercial and administrative life of the port but continuous with it, an expression of the same fundamental understanding that the city existed at the pleasure of forces more powerful than those that any human engineering could permanently control. The legacy of Thonis-Heracleion in the contemporary world is concentrated in the objects that have been recovered from the seafloor and in the stories that those objects make possible, stories about a world of international trade and cultural exchange that was as complex and as globally connected as anything that came before the modern period. The colossal statues, raised from the sea after more than 12 centuries of submersion, are among the most powerful objects in the corpus of ancient Egyptian art, not simply because of their artistic quality, which is considerable, but because of the circumstances of their recovery. The image of a granite pharaoh lying on the seafloor of an Egyptian lagoon, its face turned toward the mud and its surface encrusted with the mineral deposits of 12 centuries of underwater exposure, and then being slowly raised toward the light by the chains of an archaeologist's lifting gear. This image, which has been seen by millions of people through the photographs and films produced by the excavation team, does something that few images of ancient art can do. It makes the distance between the ancient world and the present visible and palpable, and it makes the recovery of that world feel like an act of rescue rather than simply an act of scholarship. The inscribed steels, which were still standing upright in the sediment when the divers found them, having been placed by ancient officials in positions of public visibility and having remained in those positions, submerged but intact, for more than 1,000 years, are equally powerful in their impact. The texts on these stones, which record the administrative decrees of pharaohs and the donations of Macedonian rulers to the local gods, were composed for public reading in a city that no longer exists, intended to communicate the authority of the state and the generosity of its rulers to a population that has been gone for more than 2 millennia. That these texts are still legible, that the words of Nectanebo I can still be read in the granite of his decree after 12 centuries under the sea, is one of the more remarkable facts about the survival of the ancient world into the present. The ships in the harbor, their timbers preserved by the anaerobic sediment that covered them, are among the most significant objects in the collection because of what they represent about the practical life of the city. A ship is not a monument or a religious object but a tool, a working part of the commercial infrastructure that made the city what it was, and the survival of actual ancient ships in the harbor where they once worked gives a directness and an immediacy to the evidence about ancient trade that no amount of textual or ceramic analysis can match. The bronze and gold objects from the temple precinct represent the accumulated wealth of a major religious institution across many centuries of operation, the material residue of the offerings brought by merchants and sailors and rulers from across the Mediterranean world to the gods of Thonis-Heracleion in gratitude for safe passage or in hope of commercial success. Each of these objects was brought to the temple by a specific person, on a specific occasion, for a specific reason, and together they constitute a material record of the international connections of the port that is both more vivid and more varied than any administrative text could provide. The diversity of their origins, from Greece and Cyprus and the Levant and Egypt itself, is the most direct evidence available for the genuinely international character of the city that the ancient texts describe. The silence beneath the bay of Abu Qir is the silence of depth and of mud, of a world that has been cut off from the light and the air for 12 centuries. It is a different kind of silence from the silence of Derinquiu, which was the silence of a sealed and waiting underground city, intact and ready for occupants who never came. It is a different kind of silence from the silence of Vardzia, which was the silence of a place that had been broken open and damaged and reduced but had survived in a form that still retained the shape of what it had been. The silence of Thonis-Heracleion is the silence of a place that was not sealed or broken but drowned, that went under the water and stayed there, that was preserved not by the absence of the world but by the presence of the sea. The sea is not a neutral medium. It is corrosive, and it is crushing, and it is inhabited by organisms that break down the materials of human construction with a thoroughness that nothing on dry land can match. The fact that so much of Thonis-Heracleion has survived 12 centuries of submersion in the salt water of the Egyptian lagoon is not the expected outcome of the process, but the exception, the result of a specific combination of conditions, the fine-grained sediment that sealed the site from the most destructive effects of the marine environment, the depth that kept it below the level of the most active biological and mechanical erosion, and the chemical properties of the lagoon water that were less corrosive than the open sea. The recovery of the city from this underwater silence is an ongoing process, not a completed event. Each season of excavation adds to the picture of what the city was, and each addition changes the picture in ways that cannot always be predicted. The colossal statues and the inscribed steels and the ancient ships are the most dramatic elements of the recovery, but they are not the only elements, and the thousands of smaller objects, the ceramic vessels and the bronze figurines and the lead weights and the glass beads and the gold jewelry, that have been recovered from the sediment build-up, piece by piece. The detailed picture of everyday life in an ancient port that no single spectacular find could provide. The accumulation of sediment over the site during the centuries of its submersion has created a time capsule of unusual completeness, preserving not just the durable materials of stone and metal and fired clay, but in some cases the more fragile evidence of organic materials that would have perished completely in any other depositional environment. The fact that this time capsule exists at all, that the combination of water depth and sediment type and lagoon chemistry that happened to prevail in the Bay of Abu Qir over the past 12 centuries happened to be precisely the combination best suited to the preservation of the kind of evidence that archaeologists most need, is the kind of accident that the historical record depends on and that cannot be planned for or predicted. Thonis-Heracleion survived not because its builders intended it to survive, but because the sea that swallowed it also happened to preserve it. The city that is being recovered from the sea was a real city, inhabited by real people who bought and sold goods and worshipped gods and built buildings and kept records and sailed ships and grew old and died in the place where they had built their lives. The monumental art and the royal inscriptions are the most visible evidence of their existence, but the most human evidence is in the smaller things, the ordinary objects of commercial and domestic life that document the texture of daily existence in a city that no one alive has ever seen. Standing at the water's edge in the Bay of Abu Qir today, looking out over the flat gray surface of the lagoon toward the horizon where the Egyptian coast meets the Mediterranean Sea, it is difficult to imagine that beneath the water, a few meters down through the murk and the sediment, there is a city. The surface of the lagoon gives nothing away. There are no buildings above the waterline, no monuments visible from above, no physical indication that anything other than water and sediment lies beneath. The lagoon looks exactly like what it appears to be, a shallow coastal bay on the edge of a flat and featureless delta, unremarkable except for the birds that work the shallows and the distant smudge of the city of Alexandria on the western horizon. The city beneath the surface has been invisible for more than 12 centuries, and it will remain invisible, in the literal sense of being unseen from above the water, for as long as it lies beneath the lagoon. What the excavation has done is not to make the city visible again in that literal sense, but to make it known again, to restore to the historical record a place and a time that had been lost not through destruction but through submersion. The objects that have been raised from the sea floor carry the information about the city's form and function and history that the city itself, still lying beneath the mud, cannot communicate directly. They are, in a sense, ambassadors from a world that still exists in physical form but that requires the mediation of underwater archaeology to speak. The god whose temple stood at the heart of Thonis-Heracleion, whose colossal image now lies in a conservation laboratory rather than guarding the entrance to the city, was a god of the Nile and of fertility and of the passage of souls from the world of the living to the world of the dead. The Nile is still there, still carrying the sediment of Central Africa toward the sea, still depositing the material that built the delta and the island on which the city stood and that covered the city when it fell. The sea is still there, still working against the coast, still reshaping the delta margin at the same geological pace that it has maintained for millions of years. The city is still there too, in the mud and the dark, as real and as present as it has ever been. The next diver who descends to the site, through the murk of the lagoon and down to where the sea floor begins to show the signs of ancient human presence, will be entering a place that has been under the water for 1,200 years, but that was, for 10 centuries before that, one of the busiest and most consequential places in the ancient world. That continuity between what the place was and what it is and what the ongoing excavation is slowly making it possible to know, is the heart of what Thonis-Heracleion means. If this film has kept you company through the night, consider subscribing so you never miss the next quiet journey. And if you are ready for another story from the ancient world, there is one waiting for you on the screen now.